Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to have to talking over breakfast. It's like being at my own house at breakfast time. My wife, some of you know her, Joanne is talking, my daughter's talking, I'm talking, the radio's on. So this is very familiar to me, a little bustle over breakfast. Good morning. My name is John Geddes. I am the Ottawa Bureau Chief of Maclean's magazine. What a pleasure it is to welcome you all here this morning for what is promising to be a really great conversation in this fascinating Bacon and Big Thinking event. I'm told this is the first time that the Partnership Group for Science and Engineering and the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences have joined together to host this kind of breakfast talk. It only makes sense. PAGC has the Bacon and Egghead series, and the Federation's Big Thinking series is their sort of version of this, and both these share the same ultimate goal, which is bringing cutting-edge research together with the policy and decision makers in this place on Parliament Hill. Today's showcase sort of brings us into the realm of bridging research divides between the sciences and the humanities in a pretty interesting way. Our topic, as you must know, is the future of transportation in urban centers. Around here, I think too often we forget that urban transit is really a federal issue as much as a provincial or municipal one. Many of you in the room will know that the Harper government's infrastructure policy, the New Building Canada plan, which earmarks about $50 billion in spending over the next 10 years, does target transit in a direct way. Although it's funny, I recently talked to Calgary's Mayor Naheed Nenshi about this, and he was quite pointedly critical of what he sees as a lack of clarity in the priorities on this plan and a kind of targeting, including, he specifically mentioned for transit. So it's an big ticket item, interesting subject of some policy controversy. By the way, I was really happy to get a chance to talk to Mayor Nenshi. First time I'd interviewed him, I can't think of a more newsworthy Canadian mayor. So, We're straying from the usual format this morning. We're going to start things off with some short remarks from our speakers, and then we'll have a conversation to dig deeper. And afterwards, of course, what you're probably here mostly for, which is the chance for you to ask questions. Let me start by introducing two truly outstanding thinkers. Jeff Casello is assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo. His research interests lie in urban transportation systems and their impacts on healthy and economically viable urban centers. Dr. Casello has consulted widely with municipalities and transit agencies in Canada and the US, providing decision makers with expert advice on transport developments. Jeff, by the way, I didn't say, is immediately to my right here. And over on his right is Zachary Patterson, an assistant professor in the Department of Geography, Planning, and Environment at Concordia University, where he also holds the Canada Research Chair in Transportation and Land Use Linkages for Regional Sustainability. Dr. Patterson's research focuses on the modeling of transportation, the environment, land use, and their linkages. He's also consulted extensively and is an active member of several research and policy networks. So I'm going to pass the microphone over to Jeff now to sort of get things started with some brief remarks.
Well, good morning, and thank you, first of all, very much for having us here. I think that the format for this morning is that I'm representing the engineering community, and Zach is representing the social sciences and humanities community. But I think you'll soon see that there's lots of crossover, and probably that's the motivation for this morning's session. Yesterday I was driving from Waterloo, and I checked out what my options were from Waterloo to Ottawa. Bus isn't really an option. Rail is sort of an option, although it's a little bit awkward and long, and there's a strange delay in Toronto, which is something I would encourage all of you to think quite a bit about how we might connect our cities with some high-speed rail and move into, the 20th century in rail service in Canada. And I would also, so then I thought about flying, and you know, I could go to Pearson, and I would be there for most of my life, and that would be awful, trying to get through Pearson to get to Ottawa, and by the time I got to Pearson and so on. So it turns out that car was really the only option for me, and I think that's an important point already, that we have a transportation system that has been engineered for the last 5 decades that has been unimodal. It has emphasized the car since the end of the post-war period. And I think that that's something we certainly have to do something about. When I got onto the Queensway yesterday, there were me and about 4,000 of my favorite Canadians stuck in traffic in both directions. And I just thought, what is the environmental impacts, and what is the societal impacts, and what is the impacts on Canada's economy for having these 4,000 cars stuck in the center of the nation's capital? And then I turned on to Slater Street, and all of a sudden there was bus after bus coming down full and unimpeded on the bus lane through the center of Ottawa. And I thought to myself, well, here's an alternative, I think, to what we have done for the last 5 decades. We've invested in transit, and it works, and it's functional, and it makes this city work. As I was sitting again on the highway, I thought to myself, what would the traditional engineer in 1960 or 1970 think was the answer to this problem? And of course, the answer would have been to widen that highway. And then I looked up on the side of that roadway, and I saw the houses, some of which had probably already been taken for the original investment. And certainly, we would have had to take many more for the next level of investment to widen this highway again. And I think that probably a year from now, if we were to widen that highway, it would become completely full again. And so we would be right back to the same level of congestion. So the message I want to begin with this morning is thinking about new and innovative solutions, thinking about balanced transportation, providing alternatives to travelers, engineering systems with redundancy and reliability, and thinking about really the important things. How will we pay for these things, and how can we be certain that people will use them? And that gets us into funding tools and behavioral models, and I think that's where much of what Zach's work and my work will overlap. So I'll stop there and ask Zach to make a few comments as well.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Thanks, John, for the introduction. Thanks to the Federation for inviting me, as well as PAGC. I actually am from Ottawa. I grew up in Ottawa, and when I left, I didn't expect to be in a room with such a distinguished audience at Parliament, so that's pretty exciting. And so now I'm back, and I'm here to talk to you a bit about my research, about transportation research in general, linkages with the engineering and social sciences. There's actually an awful lot of linkages between the social sciences in the way I practice it and the engineering that Jeff does. The way I like to think about it is primarily, and these, it's funny, it touches on a lot of the similar issues that Jeff brought up, but when I think about the transportation system, I think about something that's essential for our economy, for our well-being, for our livelihoods, something that each of us benefits from, not only companies getting their products from one company to another, delivering to their clients, but also the mothers and fathers who bring their kids to hockey practice. We all benefit from this system tremendously. At the same time, there are costs, what we often called externalities, that are associated with these benefits. So these are costs that we impose on society that we don't feel the full impact of. So we're thinking about congestion and pollution. These issues, and I think there are also other issues related to individuals, and maybe if you drive too much, you don't get enough exercise, and that's not so great. On the social science angle of things, or the behavioral research that we do, we look at trying to understand the decisions that people make relative to transportation. And you may or may not think about it in your everyday, but there's actually an awful lot of decisions that we make that are related to transportation. People often think of what mode do you choose? Do we take transit or the car? But there's also how many trips do we decide to make? How long are those trips when we actually make them? And perhaps, and of particular interest to me, is the question of where do we live? Because that's also going to have a huge impact on the transportation decisions that we end up making afterwards. So we try to understand the decisions that people are making. We try to understand the factors that influence those choices. And the reason we're interested in that in a planning context is to be able to say to ourselves, how is it possible to tweak these different variables, these different factors, the carrots and the sticks, to encourage people to make decisions that put better into balance the advantages, the benefits that people derive from the transportation system and the costs that they impose on others and on society. So the kinds of behavioral models that we use, we try to understand, if you build it, will they come? These are the kinds of questions that we ask. If you change the price of transit, what will that do to ridership? If you build a bike path, how many people will use it? And so I think that wraps up the comments that I had.
Zach, I'm going to ask a few questions of you guys before we open up to the floor. Why don't I start with you? When you talk about the decisions people make, are we sometimes in danger in conversations like this of speaking to a kind of elite converted group of people who like downtown living, who like, you know, sort of an urban lifestyle? And I've already bought into the idea of bike paths and not driving when we can't, because it does seem like a lot of people, no matter how many op-eds we write, still like to live in the suburbs and still don't mind, or at least are willing to get into their cars in the morning. Can you talk a bit about what are the factors? Is it possible that we're underestimating just the allure of that life and the inconvenience people are willing to put up with to have it?
So that's an excellent point. Preaching to the converted. I didn't. In fact, when I thought about the opening remarks, when I put them together, I tried to make them not sound elitist and forcing people to do things that they don't want to do. I think that that's important. People have preferences. People make decisions based on those preferences. We live in a free society. People have to be able to make the decisions that are consistent with their preferences. But there are these other elements. We do live in society, and these costs that we impose on others through our behavior is something that ought to be taken into consideration. So this is why I was talking about carrots and sticks. I don't think, well, it'd be very difficult, and probably we don't want to force everybody to live downtown. There are, a lot of the research that gets done in transportation and land use is about the benefits of the downtown lifestyles. But it becomes an imposition, something that's too great, I think, to try to force everybody to do it. But at the same time, there are mechanisms that can be used, policy mechanisms that can be used to encourage people, to not force them to do one thing or another, but to help them incorporate, to understand better the costs that are being imposed. And so you can think about things like road pricing. And and so that will change the carrots and the sticks and the types of decisions that people make.
Yeah, if I can. One thing that I think is, again, looking at this post-war model of development, one thing we've done is we've really made suburban living very convenient. We've built all of the infrastructure necessary to provide for suburban housing. So all of the roadways, all of the sewer, the water, the hydro, all of that has been created. And only in the last 10 years have we started with development charges to try and recover some of that infrastructure cost. Now, what development charges cover is the initial investment in that infrastructure, but not in the operations and maintenance of that infrastructure. And so I think if you had the mayors or the FCM in the room today, they would be telling you a lot about their municipal infrastructure deficits and the need to raise revenue to actually repair all of Canada's infrastructure. And that's the real challenge with suburban living, that these things have been vastly underpriced. And so I agree completely that there is a very large segment of society that would continue to want to live in the suburbs and continue to want to drive their car. And I think that they should be able to. But what we should do is we should make sure that the price is set correctly for those people. So if you choose that lifestyle, you know what the costs are to society, and you're being asked to pay for those.
It's fascinating. Thank you. Earlier, I alluded to, and you guys have sort of alluded to the question of this as in many cases, a municipal issue. You talk about the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Could I ask, Jeff, is there a way to think of it in national terms, or are we kind of, is it by definition something that has to be sorted out at a local level?
So I look at funding mechanisms for major transportation investments, and I'll admit now I'm American. I'm sorry. It's better to be American now than it was 15 years ago or so. Maybe that tells you my political leanings. When I look at the role that the federal government plays in transportation financing across the nations, in the U.S., something about 40 to 60% of transit projects, 40 to 60% of the transit fees are paid by the federal government. That's a regular number when they are justified through the New Starts program in the U.S. For highway and other investments, it's 90 cents on the dollar for major highway investments, and that's at the federal level. And then state governments and then local governments kick in. Our own project in Waterloo is being funded at 1/3 by the federal government, 1/3 by the provincial government, and 1/3 by local governments, rough numbers. We're grateful certainly for federal funding, but I do think that there is a role for the federal government to assist with provincial governments, because transportation, there is no question that a city like Toronto that constitutes 35% or 40% of Canadian GDP depends on its transportation system to function. There's no question that Ottawa depends on its transportation system. Calgary, Vancouver are major urban centers at which, if you total them all up, it's probably 70% of Canadian GDP depends on the ability to move around in the urban area. And without a national policy on that, if you look at the Canadian trade budget, if we didn't trade well with the U.S., we'd have an enormous national deficit in our trade values. But because we're able to trade with the U.S., we actually have a trade surplus. Our border crossings are of enormous importance to our national economy. And so the national government certainly has a role to play in making sure that our transportation functions in a way that keeps Canada globally economically competitive.
Zach, one thing that we hear about periodically when these kind of congestion issues are raised is the idea of a congestion tax, a congestion fee. It's been tried in places in various ways. London is famous for an element of it. I think recently the BC Business Council proposed that something like that should be considered for Vancouver. Do you have any thoughts on that idea of when you were talking about the carrots and sticks? I was thinking about that as a kind of a stick, I guess, part of the equation.
Well, so there are different. What happened in London and Stockholm? It's pricing that takes place when you go into a particular location. I'm not exactly sure what the BC Business Council proposed. If it's a global,
they proposed looking at a range of different congestion pricing options.
Right, and so I think the important thing is that. Really, so we're thinking about carrots and sticks. We're thinking about the costs that people are evaluating when they're making their choices. And congestion pricing is something very specific about congestion, but road pricing more generally is what seems like at least a sensible tool, politically probably completely unfeasible, especially because constituents, they like carrots and they rarely like sticks. And so that makes it complicated to put things through like this. But at the same time, I think this notion of road pricing, which changes the costs that people feel when they make their decisions about transportation, have implications not only on whether to take their car or transit, but also on all these other choices that we make. How often do we drive? How far do we drive? And where we live. So I think it's a tool that affects all of the different angles and all of the different choices that we make relative to transportation.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing. I think one thing that concerns many people is the equity associated with road pricing. So if you charge people to travel, those who are in the lowest income are going to feel that the hardest. And so what I always think about is how do we invest in alternatives so that there are redundancy in our transportation networks before we begin the road pricing. So we say a decade from now we're going to toll the Gardiner Expressway in downtown Toronto, or we're going to toll the Queensway in central Ottawa. And in that decade in between, we provide alternatives. We do that with public funding, and then we guarantee the return on investment from the public funding through road tolls. So you have a guaranteed road source of funding 10 years down the road. And to me, that makes the most sense. The fact that there are 16 lanes of 401 through the GTA that are perpetually congested and are unpriced, to me, is an astronomical failure of transportation planning. I can't fathom that that's the case. I mean, every major city globally. In Singapore, it costs you $40,000 to have the right to buy a $40,000 car, and they use those things. In Singapore, they want to build 300 more kilometers of metro at 300 million a kilometer, and they don't worry about the price because they have such revenue tools in place. They just build it, and to me, that's progressive transportation planning.
Zach, when you mentioned that politicians like carrots, or I guess constituents like carrots rather than sticks, and then translates into what politicians like, it made me think of a broader question. Both you guys have advised people who are policymakers in government. We've got a lot of policymakers here. Can you talk just generally about what are the misconceptions or what are the barriers, do you think, between this kind of research you do and the kind of factors that are considered when policy is being developed? Do you want to have a go first?
Okay. Jeff? Sure. Sorry. I'm an academic. I talk too much. That's what we do. So where are there misconceptions? The misconception for me, the most important one, is that people are wed to their car. People are wed to their car because it's very convenient, but we design our systems to be that way. And we design and we price our systems to be that way. My own story is interesting. I grew up in a suburban small community, drove every place. I went to school in Philadelphia where I learned to live without a car. I met my wife. We got married. We returned to Philadelphia for grad school. It was the first time that she had ever lived without without a car, but we function. I mean, we function really well in a city without a car. And once a month or something, we would rent a car and travel to our parents' house, and we would do the things we needed to do with a car, and that was enough. And you know, we realized that that's not for everybody. But what we've designed and built in the post-war period is a urban center that concentrates on the 99 or the 90% that want to do that with their car, and excludes, in some ways, the 10% who want to have the other kind of lifestyle. And you know, I don't think we're ever going to talk about monumental shifts in Canada. The density in Singapore is 10 times what the density is in central GTA, and so we're not going to get there. In Karlsruhe city in Germany, they have a population of 250,000, and they have 300 kilometers of light rail transit. We're not going to get there, but we should move in a direction that way, where we can have better transit, where we can have better walking, where we can have better cycling, where we have land use that supports all of those things. I think for too long we've been thinking in only one direction, and I think if there's one takeaway message, it really is that there's small changes that can move on the margins, that can produce redundancy and really improve the way our transportation and our land use systems work.
Yeah. To add to what Jeff was saying, I think in a certain sense it's true. Often people in transportation planning are a little bit conservative in terms of what they can expect as changes. And so it's not to be too afraid of that, but also to understand in people's decisions what is the decisions that they make, how do they make them, and that by changing the different aspects of it, they actually can encourage people to change their transportation behavior. And I'm thinking from customer perspectives often, this is how you see it a little bit in the people I've worked with in marketing in the transportation agencies, trying to take a more client-based approach. How can we improve things so that people will want to use transit? And it makes me think, I used to work in Switzerland, and I used to work in a laboratory of train engineers, and these are the people who kind of helped design the fantastic Swiss train system, but often they'd be telling me their stories about why something didn't work or why, and their complaints were often about the passengers. And so you got the impression that, well, if there weren't passengers, the train system would work perfectly. And so that's something that I think transportation planners really need to think about. We want to make the transportation systems attractive so that people use them, and it's complicated because they're people, but that's who you want on your trains.
Just say one more thing quickly. I think one thing that we're really prone to do is to extrapolate. So we've said our travel demand is growing by 5% every year, so we should just accommodate that demand. And that mindset has to change as well. Planners and engineers, the safety net is really to say, well, history says that this is what we should do. And I think changing that philosophy is really important.
We've been talking a little bit like here as if transportation systems can be considered as sort of sealed off from other policy areas, but could I ask either of you, or both of you maybe, to comment on the broader question of land use planning as it relates to transportation planning? Zach, you want to go first?
Yeah, first, great. Yeah, thanks. So it's a great question, John, and my research works really intimately at this question. And I mentioned a little bit at the beginning, these decisions that people are making aren't just about transportation, they're also about where to live. Where we live has a big impact on the transportation decisions that we decide to make. And at the same time, for transportation planners, when you're planning new LRT lines or new metro lines, being able, or even highways, being able to coordinate the transportation aspect of things with the land use side of things, making sure that you can encourage people to live near this new infrastructure is extremely important to that being a success, that the infrastructure itself being a success on the transportation side.
And the other end of the trip is also really important. Where do our firms locate? And it used to be a time when all firms wanted to be next to each other because they were really strong agglomerative forces. You needed to be next to if you ran the mill, you needed to be next to the power source, and you need to be near the labor source. And those forces are much less strong now. You can be, if you're an insurance business, you can be anywhere, and you're connected by telecommunications and so on. So our employment is also dispersing. And so we need some tools to try to motivate employers to stay in higher density areas and to stay in agglomerative places so that we can serve them better by less transportation infrastructure.
We'll get to questions from the floor very soon. Maybe just one more round to you guys. When you talk about land use and you talk about what you're talking about in choices where people put their businesses, I think about the long-standing discussions about trying to create hubs or concentrated areas like out in what we traditionally think of as sort of suburban sprawl areas. Can you talk about best cases? Are there places where people have shown that they can really accomplish that? It seems like almost a dream for the past decades in urban planning. Zach, you look like you want to have a go. Go ahead. Sure.
I feel like that's a very big challenge, creating hubs, because there are so many other dynamics that exist in the location of, and if we're thinking hubs, particularly with firms, it's difficult to, in fact, it's interesting. A colleague of mine was in Vancouver, and he was giving a course in Vancouver, and they visited a number of different municipalities along the SkyTrain line, and he got to the municipality that was the furthest out, and he talked to them, and they said, well, we'd like to be the number 2 employment hub in Vancouver. And he said, oh, well, that's interesting. And they talked about all the different things they were planning to do. And they moved along the SkyTrain line. Turns out just about every municipality along the SkyTrain line said the same thing. And it's clear that everybody would like to have lots of employment and create employment hubs. But it's a big challenge. But one, not only is it a challenge to actually do it, but it actually has important implications for the kinds of trips that people make and what kinds of modes they can use.
But I do think there are some policy tools that do that. Just look at the way the Calgary LRT line evolved. There are park and ride after park and ride after park and ride around each of the stations. So it basically precludes any kind of high-density development, any kind of concentrations of employment there. And I think, if you're going to invest billions of public dollars, you want to take advantage of the land use that you create. And so park and ride, some cases may be the best use of that land, but I would suggest it's not always the best case. And there's lots of economic tools that can be in place. So you can waive development charges. You can use tax increment financing. There's a whole series of economic tools, carrots, that you can bring developers to those station areas in a way that sometimes is impossible in Canada, sometimes is impossible municipally, but those policies certainly should be looked at in a way. And certainly just at the municipal level, zoning bylaws are incredibly important. And the one thing we haven't talked at all about is about parking standards. And we are still in an era where we think about parking minima. So if I'm going to develop something, I have to supply a minimum number of parking spaces, which is completely contrary to all of the other things that we've talked about. So parking and economic incentives and land use controls around the station areas are ways that we can actually influence where firms are going to locate.
Okay, great. I could keep going here all morning for sure. It's so interesting to hear these guys talking about this stuff, but there's a microphone in the very middle of the room, and lest there be a revolt, I think I should start letting some questions come up from you guys. Please, go ahead.
Oh, quelle passion. Je suis
excuse me, can I ask you to identify yourself first?
Hélène Leblanc, Member of Parliament for La Salle-et-Mar. So just to tell you very briefly, I am between Pont-Mercier and Pont-Champlain on the island of Montreal, underneath the Turcotte Exchange. So there you go. And we have a densely populated area, fairly, especially the Ville-et-Mar section. And we were talking about the 10% of people that live in those areas that have to deal with the highway, the byways, and the high traffic, dealing with cars. I'm an avid cyclist that like to commute to work, and we just heard today that a Montrealer cyclist was killed in a tunnel. So all these challenges that we have, not only in urban area, we have the regions and everything, and I think Canada is not using its know-how and to have leadership to take those challenges and turning them into opportunities. We have Bombardier, we have a lot of tools here, university and things like that, and we're not using them to answer the challenge that we have. So I'm putting across those challenges of the Champlain Bridge, the Turcotte Exchange, and all those things. And what do you envision? I know there's some plans. We're not too sure what they're going to look like, what it's going to be, the impact on the population on the island of Montreal and so forth. So what would you envision in your dream about those challenges that are faced with the infrastructure project that are coming forward? And if we could envision that. Thank you very much.
Zach, you're from Montreal.
Yeah, from Montreal. And I'm on the hot seat. So this is a very complicated area between the Champlain and the Mercier Bridge. As the Champlain Bridge, as you may know, there are pieces of it that are falling apart. They're trying to rebuild it. It gets closed down often. Same thing with the Mercier, and then they want to rebuild the Turcotte. So this is really an area of high density, of high capacity road transportation infrastructure that requires a great deal of investment. So very complicated area, and but I think my dream, or the thing that I can imagine being the most helpful, is really this question of properly pricing the different modes, and the one that seems to be most out of whack right now is the automobile. So road pricing that can lead to decreases in automobile use, transportation demand management, and those funds can be used to help improve the infrastructure where there are really problems. And of course, at the more micro level, there are lots of things that can be done from an urban planning perspective and planning to make things more walkable and cyclable. But that's my big picture.
I'll just say one thing. My home city is Boston. In the 1950s, sorry for Canadian fans, in the spirit of the playoffs. Well, can you get me tickets for next week's game? So in Boston in the 1950s, we built the Central Artery. It divided the entire city on an elevated freeway. In the aughts, we took it down for $14 billion. The price tag was astronomical. There's issues there. But we did recover our city by taking down this enormous freeway through the core of our city. And now it is parkland, it is developable land. The north end of the city is reconnected to the center city. So it can be done. And the Gardiner Expressway in the city of Toronto has massive infrastructure challenges. And I would encourage leadership to think about whether or not the Gardiner Expressway in its current form is the right thing for the urban fabric of the city of Toronto.
That's interesting, Jeff. I was in Boston for a year during the Big Dig, and it was a stupendously massive thing. It's just an amazing project. Please go ahead, sir.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Raymond Côté, député de Beauport-Limoilou, dans la belle ville de Québec. D'ailleurs, mes circonscriptions se trouvent à avoir une moitié vraiment très urbaine et l'autre moitié banlieue, bungalow. C'est pas rare que je vois 2, 3, 4 voitures à la porte des maisons. D'ailleurs, j'ai résisté durant 1 an et demi à l'attrait, en fait, à l'idée d'avoir une automobile moi-même après mon élection. Mais mon équipe a fait tellement de pression parce que la partie nord de ma circonscription était trop peu accessible par d'autres moyens que l'automobile que j'ai cédé. Alors, je suis l'heureux propriétaire d'une Acura maintenant, à mon grand malheur. Ceci étant, un des débats qui fait rage à Québec, parce que notre système de transport en commun est relativement peu évolué. Un des gros problèmes, un des projets très controversés, excusez-moi, c'est la construction de 2 lignes de tramway. À l'époque, il y a de ça 3-4 ans, on parlait d'un coût à 1,5 milliard de dollars. Paradoxalement, il y a eu plusieurs dizaines de milliers de personnes qui ont signé une pétition pour l'élargissement de l'autoroute Henri IV pour atteindre 3 voies avec une voie réservée pour le covoiturage. Alors, ça a été très, très populaire, largement supporté. Vous savez, un des paradoxes, puis j'aimerais que vous commentiez là-dessus, c'est qu'en fin de compte, même si le projet de tramway était à 2 milliards de dollars, l'élargissement d'une autoroute, dans le fond, c'est un coût d'à peu près le tiers ou le quart du projet total de tramway. Puis je prends aussi l'exemple de l'échangeur entre l'autoroute Charret et l'autoroute Robert-Bourassa, qui était de l'ordre de 400 millions. Ce genre de montant-là ne fait absolument pas sourciller les gens. En fait, ils acceptent ça très facilement. Ça ne prête pas à débat. Les gens, en fait, se plaignent plutôt du délai dans les travaux et non pas du coût, alors que le coût, justement, de l'implantation d'une infrastructure comme une ligne de tramway, c'est quelque chose qui devient une obsession dans l'esprit des gens. J'aimerais que vous commentiez parce que vous avez été très, très loin, justement, dans le comportement puis les choix que les gens peuvent faire. Merci.
Jack, some themes coming up.
Yes. Je ne sais pas s'il faut répondre en français ou en anglais. Le problème, c'est que ce matin, on avait un interview à CBC, juste à côté, et puis la madame a posé à peu près la même question. Comment ça se fait que les gens sont prêts à accepter la construction d'autoroutes plus facilement que pour le transport en commun. Mais c'est Jeff qui a répondu, et lui, il avait vraiment une réponse que je trouvais super. Et donc, mais je ne sais pas s'il a compris, donc je vais juste... What am I supposed to tell? This morning, you know... Did they ask the question about why people are more willing
to
accept on them?
So, sorry, my French is non-existent. If anyone wishes to speak Spanish, I can help a little bit. So, when we talk about funding for transit and funding for automobiles, there really is a huge dichotomy. People who use transit obviously are eager to see improved transit and are eager to have it funded. But there is, in my own city in Waterloo now, there's the peak hour mode share is 7%, and there are 93% traveling by car. And so when you ask a community of 500,000 or 550,000 to spend $818 million in the short term and $1.9 billion over the 30-year contract for a transit system, there are many people who say, I'm never going to use it, my children will never use it, why should I have to pay for this? And the way I answer that is that, in fact, our light rail transit system is actually preserving the ability to use your car. If we didn't have a light rail transit system, then everyone would be using their car and everyone would be suffering. By investing in light rail transit, what we're really doing is we're protecting the suburban way of life because we are concentrating for those who wish to do so. We are intensifying in a central corridor, and we're leaving the suburbs in a way that makes sense. And so by investing in a transportation system that you're never going to use, in fact, you're protecting your own transportation system from over-demand. And that's always been my answer to that. I think the most important thing is to think about this holistically, not as individual pieces of infrastructure and in my neighborhood and in your neighborhood, but the system as a whole has to be thought about.
Fantastic. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Ruel Amder, and I write for Canadian Charger. I'd like to hear a little bit more about Park and Ride. The other thing that I wonder if you'd comment on is how municipalities pay for the things relating to transit, considering the reliance on the property tax and the refusal of provinces to allow a municipal income tax. This is, I think, particularly interesting because here in Ottawa, the mayor opposes a municipal income tax.
Who'd like to go? Okay. So the first is about Park and Ride. There are certainly places where Park and Ride makes sense. In Philadelphia, you can come down I-95, which is the spine of the east coast of the United States, come towards Center City, Philadelphia, and enter a Park and Ride lot. And then you park in what is otherwise undevelopable land, and you immediately board the regional rail system and come directly to the downtown. In Calgary, the system is very different. These are areas where we've built very large parking facilities that really have precluded other kinds of development. So I think it's not a very good use of land. Certainly in our own case, again, in Waterloo, we have stations in our central core, and we don't want parking there. You're meant to come by other transit modes or by walking or cycling. That's how it is. So you have to look and see what the balance of the potential land uses are and whether or not it makes sense to allocate some to parking. On the issue of municipal financing, I think that one easy way without a municipal income tax is a municipal parking fee. So if we were to put a $1 tariff on every parking fee that was paid in the city of Toronto, it would be anywhere between 10 and 1 and 10%, depending on where you're parking, or I guess 3 and 10%, depending on where you're parking, an additional charge. And it would create enormous sums of revenue for transit investments. And when I think about taxation, I think about the fact that it should be directly relatable to the benefit that the person who is paying derives. So if I'm going to pay a tax for a transportation, I should do it through a transportation activity. So if I pay to park, but that provides me an alternative to not parking, that makes a lot of sense to me. It deals with the equity issues associated with taxation. So I think that's parking charges is something. Now, of course, if downtown Ottawa has parking charges, all of a sudden malls in Canada and outside of the area become much more attractive, right? And so you really have to think regionally about your parking strategy so you have the right balance of competitiveness, so you don't displace people by charging for parking in one area but not in others.
I did want to add a little bit about the park and rides. Touch on what Jeff had said, but I think it is important. You can't have high density development around all stations that would currently be used as park and ride stations. But what is, I think, important is to build in flexibility so that were the conditions propitious to that in the future, that it would be possible for it to happen. It wouldn't be locked into just parking, but it would be possible to actually develop it.
Go to a next question.
I'm Mike Sullivan. I'm a member of Parliament for region called York Southwest and in Toronto. We're currently the One of the biggest transit construction sites in North America is in the heart of my riding, but it's, in my view, stupid transit, not smart public transit. And this comes back to politicians getting involved in transit decisions. And we had a subway being built in the early 90s that the next government filled in the holes, and the holes are now being dug again. So we've spent tremendous amounts of money doing that. We're building a subway to an area that up until very recently was pasture land, but I guess cows need subways too. And we were going to build an LRT in the east end of Toronto, but it needed to become a subway in order for a by-election to be changed, the direction of a by-election went. So, and the construction zone in my riding is a $2.5 billion link between the airport and downtown that only 5,000 people a day will use at an enormously large fare. So it's not going to be real public transit. So my question is, how do you get the politics out of the transit decision-making so that we're not making stupid decisions, we're making only smart decisions about the money we spend?
Politician asking that question. That's interesting.
I'm afraid to take the microphone.
We'd like to have a go. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very interesting question. I often hear this from people that it's all political anyway, so what are you doing? And in a sense, it's true. These decisions often are highly political, highly politicized. There's a lot of money at stake, a lot of different interests also. And I don't actually think it's possible to take the politics out of it because of the nature of democracy, the nature of our government, and all that. But all that to say that I think thinking about these issues and thinking about what smart transit is and being able to come up with good answers for that is important for influencing the political process. You can't always have it come your way and be completely abstracted from politics, but if you can get the messaging right and get the answers right to try to build that proper transit, to try to encourage the interaction between the transport system and the land use system to make sure that when we build an LRT line, we have the possibility of increasing density around it. To make what you said, I thought was a great expression, smart transit. I think that's important. I think it'll be difficult to take out the political from the process.
I think there are domains where I think the problem you have is that people have modal biases. People see transit as subways, or transit as light rail transit, or transit as busways. About a decade ago, there's this great success with bus rapid transit in South America, and there was great force to bring these modes to North America. Let's do everything with buses, because buses will solve the problem, and they're much less expensive than rail systems. But what people didn't understand is that labor costs in South America are 15% of what they are in North America. So as you get higher demand, your operating costs go really high very quickly. And so there are certain domains where a mode makes sense. There's a bus domain and an LRT domain and a subway domain, but there's also places where they overlap, and that's where you have to have some vision and some technical leadership, and I think that's where things fall down a little bit. I asked my second-year engineering students, how many of you want to be consultants? And nearly all the room hands go up. And how many of you want to be lawyers? And a couple of hands go up. And how many of you want to be politicians? And no hands go up. So what we need is some technical expertise in political arena as well.
Thanks very much. I was afraid that the conversation might get jargony here today, and I wouldn't understand, but smart and stupid are expressions that I'm for smart transit, I think. Next question.
Hi, my name is Scott. I just wanted to ask, one of the major issues in Ottawa in the last few years has been segregated bike lanes, and I just wanted to get your views on what the proper design and use of segregated bike lanes would be in a city.
I think the most important thing for me when you're designing bicycle lanes are two things. One is to make sure that the cyclist is always in the natural vision area for the driver. So you want to make sure that the driver, when he or she are driving, they are simply looking in a direction and the cyclist is there. So when you isolate a cyclist, for example, behind parked cars, it's very safe between the intersections, but at the intersections it becomes really problematic because the driver hasn't seen this cyclist. The second thing is around maintenance. So if you're going to segregate the bike lane, you have to make sure that you have a dedicated maintenance plan, because as soon as you take them off the roadway, it's not going to be plowed as part of the normal maintenance process. And so when you segregate, you have to make sure that there's a reasonable maintenance plan in place. So those are always the two principles that I go by when I'm designing. We have a debate going on now in Uptown Waterloo, the same question. Should the cycle lane be behind the cars, in front of the cars? Should there be a physical barrier between them? And those are basically the principles. So where you can get a segregated bike lane, there's really great designs where you have segregated between the intersections, but then you bring the bike lane back onto the street at the intersection so the cyclist becomes really visible to cars coming through the intersection. So if you have, you can reach me and we can exchange some designs if you wish. Thanks.
Jeff, can I ask a follow-up on that? Everyone likes bikes. It's hard not to like them, but how serious are they as a part of an actual transportation system? Are they closer to a recreational part of the thing, or can they be a practical part of the fix?
So we did some work where we gave GPS units to cyclists so we could see when and where they traveled. And it turns out that cyclists have exactly the same commute patterns that everybody else does. They leave it between 7 and 9. They come home between 4 and 6. And we saw on our major corridors that we were having 2 or 3 or 4% of the travel on those corridors were by cycling. So it's not an insignificant amount, particularly when you're talking about in peak hour. The real problem with cycling right now is we don't have any plans in place to measure cycling. We don't count the data. We don't know how many people are doing it. So people discount cyclists. On the census, what's left of it, we ask and we say, and we say, what is your dominant mode to work? And everyone's dominant mode to work nearly is car. But if you take your cycle to work 1 day a week, that's 20% of your commute trips are by cycling. It can be really significant, but we don't ask that question. So the answer is we have to gather data so we can know the answer to the question, but in the limited evidence we have, they are actually a reasonable number and worthy of accommodation.
It's very interesting. Another question.
Yes, my name is Chung Sen Leong. I'm Member of Parliament for Willowdale. I probably have the distinction of one of the most dense populated ridings in North Canada, certainly from 401 to Steeles. I have 5 subway stops, and probably more than 50% of my constituents live in a high-rise. I'm also a transportation engineer by training. I was trained at University of Southern California, and I also spent 10 years building subway systems around the world. We have touched upon technological solutions, we touched upon funding solutions, we touched upon economic models, we touched upon the characteristic, and we touched upon all of those. I'm appreciative of the fact that academians and policy planners do all this. What I see very lacking in my 10 years experience of building subways around the world is that there is a tool that is not properly used, and that is land use planning. The premises for that is that if your land use planning is done properly, you can then predict your density, you can preserve your green space, and by predicting your density, you can always make sure that the subway that you put in is sustainable. For example, Hong Kong, Singapore, both of which I had a hand in doing some feasibility studies for, as well as Shanghai, Beijing, and Taipei, and Bangkok, and Kuala Lumpur. So, if you look at all those models, the politics of that is not so much that it's not involved, it's that the land use planner says, this is where we see we're going, so therefore the politicians follow that. I could see that model happening in Asia. I'm sitting here in North America, and I'm frustrated by the fact that in our short 4-year term, 5-year term democracy in North America, we do not have that long-range vision to carry that through. So what I'd like you to share with us is, in your experience around the world, what have you seen that works, and why in North America we cannot go to a model where we respect the land use planners' plan for cities? Now, you take a sample of places like Vienna, places like Prague. I mean, they've got track systems that are put in there, in Geneva, track systems that are put in there, centuries ago, and it's still working. So I'd like to hear your views on that.
Great question, really interesting. I think this ties in with the gentleman's question before about smart transit. Very intimately related with that is being able to properly plan land use. I think the question was, why can't we plan land use in North America in the same way that they do in Asia or even in Europe? Is that the big push. So I think there are a number of reasons for it, and I think probably the most important is the fact that in Europe and in Asia, many of the cities that exist grew up, their cores were really developed before the age of the automobile. And in North America, we end up, the cores of a lot of our cities, Toronto and Montreal are a little bit different, but for the most part in the rest of North America, you know, the big cities, New York and all that, it's different, but they didn't grow up without the constraint of not having the automobile. So we ended up with these land use systems that were spread out. People live in those places. It's difficult to turn back the clock. So that's one thing that's complicated about it. And I think there are quite different political cultures that make it less obvious for how to place land use controls and land use zoning. Especially so the federal government obviously can't play much of a role at land use zoning at a municipal level in Canada, which is not the case for other jurisdictions. Geneva, that you mentioned, it's a federal system like ours as well, but people seem to be more willing to accept these kinds of land use constraints than they often do here. And so I think it's true. That's what we need to do. We need to be able to plan, think about the future, allow, and it's a little bit what I was mentioning before about these park and ride stations. The flexibility in the zoning needs to be there so that if the conditions are right for allowing land use to develop, a density of land use around transit, for example, that it should be there. But I think that the conditions are quite different in North America than they are in some of these places that really have excellent examples of the coordination of transport and land use policy. How do we change that? I think Jeff has an answer.
Thanks. I'm not sure if I should be embarrassed or what. I think, suppose we said to municipalities, we're only going to return the gas tax to municipalities if you have in place land use programs that encourage intensifications. So instead of having maxima densities in your area, you're going to have minimum densities. Suppose we're going to only return the gas tax if you have in place parking maxima instead of parking minima. So link the return of the gas tax to appropriate land use policies. Part of the gas tax return is supposed to be that there's a sustainability plan in place for the region. In the region of Waterloo, we have an environmentally sensitive landscapes. You can't build there. We have a countryside line that you can't build outside. We have economic tools along our central transit corridor to create intensification, and we have penalties for building outside of those areas, and that's how the policies change. But I think from the federal level, if you tie your funding to consistency with best practices in land use planning, then then municipalities have a motivation to change their behavior.
That's what I would have said too.
Another question in the middle mic.
Hi, I'm Sabrina Doyle from Canadian Geographic. I'm wondering if, and this might not be exactly possible to answer in a straightforward way, but would you be able to give me a bit of a comparison between how much it costs both in time and money to expand a roadway versus build a bike lane?
Yeah, the bike lane's cheaper. The funding for roadway construction really depends on so many things. It's hard to give you $1 per kilometer kind of value because it depends if you're taking right of way. It depends if you're at grade or above grade. In Waterloo, we're taking a 2-lane road and we're turning it into a 4-lane road. It'll be an underpass under a railway, and for 500 meters, it's $50 million. So that's a high end because there's a grade separation and there's over rail tracks and the construction is difficult. Bike lanes, same sort of thing. It depends if you're talking about paint or if you're talking about segregated bike lanes. But, obviously the answer is it's orders of magnitude cheaper to build a bike lane. And what's actually interesting is from a human capacity point of view, the bike lane probably has more capacity than the roadway does in terms of moving human beings rather than vehicles.
Another question.
My name is Michael Dwyer. I'm with the Natural Sciences Engineering Research Council, but I have a couple of social science questions. The first one on the human factor, at what price does gasoline tax or cost have an effect? Because we're at $1.40 a liter and I don't see a change. The second one is with public transit versus cars. How big a factor is people's desire for either personal space, which you get with a car, or status, which you get with an expensive car, versus being shoved on a bus?
Shoved
on a bus.
So yeah, there's two questions. The first one,
Changing gas prices.
changing gas prices, right? I hear this a lot actually, and often I hate to say it from engineers that gas prices don't matter in how people drive. I've been asked the question: when will people's behavior change? At what price? It was in the States. I said $4 a gallon. We're there now. We're at $4 a gallon. But my true intuition about it is not that gas prices, people don't pay attention to them. They do, and we can see that in the aggregate numbers. When gas price changes, gasoline consumption goes down. There's no doubt about it. So the answer to the question is, any price change will have an effect, even if we don't see it. But clearly, the higher the price goes, the faster it goes, the harder it hits, and the more likely it is to have an impact. So that's the answer to that one. And the other question? Oh yes, being shoved in the bus. What is? How important is it to have a
Comfort status.
right?
Comfort.
So, I mean, technically, we can measure those things. I don't know offhand, but it's significant enough that the majority of people travel to work by car. It's not a very great answer.
Talk about that a little bit. So when we do travel forecasting models, what we do is we add up the cost of the trip that we can measure. So what's your travel time, what's your out-of-pocket expense, those kinds of things. And then we do that for transit, we do that for auto, and then we predict which percentage of the people will use transit and which percentage will use auto. And we always over-predict the transit percentage because we don't take into account the convenience of your car, the status of your car, those kinds of things. And what we do is we artificially put in a bias constant. We say transit costs this much more so that we can have our results match what we see in reality. And that's what we do. That's how the models work. And there's lots of people who are doing research on trying to figure out what goes into that bias constant, myself included. And certainly the status of your car, the comfort of your car, those things matter on your when you're making that choice. We actually are doing a survey with our handheld, with your smartphone, that says, what's your satisfaction of your trip now? And it asks you all the way along, and then it asks you, what's the change in your satisfaction? Is it because the bus is so crowded? Was the driver rude? Did you not get a seat? Is the driver poor? These kinds of things. And we're trying to quantify that mode constant. But that's a really important question, because if we don't understand that bias towards the automobile, then all of the policy changes we make, all of the transit changes we make, may not produce any positive results in terms of transit ridership.
Just the comment about it being a bias. So it's true that traditional kind of simple, what are called mode choice models, won't take into account all of these different factors. But I think strictly speaking, it's not a bias. It's information that is unaccounted for. Yeah.
Jeff, you allude to rude drivers there. As a rider of OC Transpo, that's a foreign concept to me, so I may ask you later how that goes. We're down to our last question, sir, so if you could make it quick, that'd be great.
Sure. Alexander Maclean, retired engineer, lawyer. Two things. I have a bicycle. I suggest you come back here in December and suggest you're going to take your bicycle anywhere in December. Sorry, mine goes into the garage. The other point is that a very good friend of mine developed Canada. And the idea was to have a satellite area with area set aside for high-tech industry, et cetera, so you could live there, work there, do your groceries, everything like that. And you would come in, you want to go to the theater, that sort of thing. Of course, what happened was that companies such as Nortel tanked. And, of course, a lot of people lost their jobs. They had to come downtown, that sort of thing. So that's one of the risks, that you do the best planning you can, and that sort of thing can happen. So the result is you get commuters having to come downtown and find jobs when they live out in Canada, where they initially thought they could do everything there. So the best laid plans of mice and men gang astray, if you know you're Scottish. Okay, thanks.
Quick response to that, you guys?
I think that the key thing there is that you try to do everything you can to maintain Canada as a self-contained entity, right? The important thing is you don't develop all the way along the connection between Canada and downtown. That's where the real trouble begins. So in the new concept of the expanded city, we have nodes and corridors, and we try to concentrate on the nodes and concentrate even along the corridors, but we don't let growth happen in places where there's no facilities. So.
Thanks very much for all those great questions, and thanks for your great answers, you guys. That was terrific. Before we wrap up, on behalf of PAGSI and the Federation, I'd like to thank the Speaker of the House, Andrew Scheer, and MP James Rajat. It's thanks to them that we're able to hold these events here in the beautiful Parliamentary Restaurant. Also, thanks to the sponsors who make these events possible: Canary, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. PAGSI and the Federation are grateful for your continued support. And finally, many thanks again to Jeff and Zach for joining us here today and providing us with so much food for thought. Thank you all for joining us. I'll mention that a video of today's conversation will be available shortly on the Federation's website and also on my home website, macleans.ca. Stay tuned for further information on Bacon and Eggheads breakfasts and big thinking events. We hope that we'll be able to do this again very soon.